What we're going to look at today is a book within a book. It's called the Book of the Covenant, and it apparently represents what Moses wrote after the giving of the Ten Commandments. Wrote in a book, he says, probably he wrote it on skins rather than a book like we would think of a book, I guess. But he wrote all this out that God revealed to him. So it's really written by God through Moses. And it's called the Book of the Covenant. So that's what we're going to look at. We'll get a view of that in just a minute. Let's remember the real purposes of the book of Exodus were to establish and to maintain faith in Jehovah through a God-centered description of events. And we're focusing probably in the first half of the book of Exodus on the miracles that God did that show his power and his leadership of the people. And then in the last half of the book, to set forth the divine directives and judgments concerning spiritual values and moral ethical imperatives, the laws that God gave, the rules and the laws the rabbis claimed. You'll remember the Israelites came out of Goshen, the area near the Mediterranean Sea, in the lower part or upper part, we would look at it, I guess, of Egypt, and came down the Sinai Peninsula, we believe, close to the joining of the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba, in that region east of Egypt. Okay? Where we have been and what we have been looking at is God designating Israel as his chosen people, and then making a covenant with them, an agreement, a kind of a contract with the people. He offered this covenant with its guidelines. He would be their God if they would serve him and be his people. And the people accepted that. And that's what brings us up to the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments were given as basic principles of right and wrong by God to be faithfully kept by the people. And if you read carefully those 10 commandments, you see the character of God, you see the nature of God, the justice of God, you see the fairness of God, you see the ability through them to show God that you love God and you love your neighbor. And so the Ten Commandments were to be very faithfully kept by the people. They're positive commandments. They're not the kind of commandments that are weak or without purpose. They're objective. They're really kind of black and white statements, we've said all along, and that's important. The Ten Commandments themselves, though, did not contain any provision for enforcement. So some of those laws are what we're talking about today. These next 3 chapters of Exodus that we're looking at, the Book of the Covenant, have some punch in terms of judicial observance and justice provided in them. Penalties for violations in some of these cases. We have 4 cases where capital punishment is provided for in the Book of the Covenant here. So while there was no judiciary to justify adjudication of the cases, no applications in questions of dispute within the 10 Commandments themselves, that comes up in the Book of the Covenant, that it appears here. So what we have is a collection of regulations in these 3 chapters, commonly called the Book of the Covenant, or the Covenant Code, it's referred to. The Book of the Covenant is what it is called in Exodus 24, the next chapter. Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. Then he took the Book of the Covenant and read in the hearing of the people. So that's what it's called, the Book of the Covenant. Okay? Now we've pretty well looked at that as we go. The Book of the Covenant begins with the statement, these are the judgments, and that word judgments means rules, the rules which you shall set before them. And that's in Exodus 21, verse 1. That's where it begins. And then it closes, the Book of the Covenant closes in Exodus 24. It says, Moses came and told the people all the words, and that word words is not just words on a paper to be read. Those are commands. The commands of the Lord, literally, is what that word means in the Hebrew, of the Lord, and all the judgments, that's rules. We had that in verse 1 of 21. So the words of the Lord and the judgments, or the rules. So that's, the rabbis divide the book into rules and commands, or words that are to be observed. Okay? That gets that. Now, we're going to have some specifics as we move forward. And the first is found in the first 11 verses of chapter 21. So you might want to have your Bible open and look as we go. The Israelites had some situations where Hebrews were enslaved. That word is used quite often, but it is more like obligated to work among the Jews. And what I'm going to say about that is that the Jews did not see their brothers in the Israelite family as slaves. They saw foreigners that they took as slaves. They could take slaves as among the foreigners. But their own men they saw as servants more. So we might ought to use the word servant. I'm going to show you something in a minute that'll back me up on that, okay? Israelite servants or slaves could serve no longer than 6 years. In the 7th year, they would go free with their families in most cases. So that's an interesting thing. Now, what I want to show you about this is a passage in Leviticus chapter 25. And it is stated in the case of a brother selling himself to another to pay a debt. And it's a further explanation of the book of the covenant regulations on servitude. And this appears in Leviticus 25. If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, that is either to pay a debt or to pay debts to others, you see, you shall not make him serve as a slave. You see that? You shall not make him serve as a slave, and he shall be to you as a hired worker. He took a job. You treat him like you would if he's working for you in your grocery store or whatever. As a hired worker and as a sojourner, he shall serve with you until the year of the Jubilee. That would be the 50th year. Now, this is specifically for the payment of debt, or if a person became poor and had to work for somebody else, you see. The law originally included this, but it would include in the book of the covenant, our passage in Exodus, it would include if you were indebted to someone in some other way, like you had damaged him. Or if you were a thief and you took his stuff, you have to pay him back. And if you didn't have it, you'd had to pay him double back, actually, under the law, if you remember the law on that. And so this passage I'm showing you is a specific passage in the case of becoming poor. All right? Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own clan and return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but shall fear your God. Okay? One of the differences between, last week we talked a little bit about the laws of Hammurabi in that ancient period. Do you remember we talked a little bit about that last time? And the laws of Hammurabi did not have the sympathy to the people, for the people, that God's law had. We read an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and we get real heavy-handed with the law of Moses. If you read it carefully, God was very concerned for the people. And that comes through with a little closer reading. You get your mind hung up on some of these capital punishment laws or rules, some of the specific rules for sacrifices and observances of religious festivals and things like that. You get yourself hung up on that, and you skip over, too often we do, what God is saying really about the people and how much he cares about the people and how these laws will guide the people to be the kind of people that they should be, you see. Now, you don't get that in Hammurabi's rules, and you get that in the law of Moses. And I'd like for us to think in those terms while we're studying this. We're going to study the religious laws here next week and the following week. And then Matt's going to take us through Leviticus, and we'll want to watch for God's evidences of his concern for the people, and especially for the poor people, the widows, the orphans, the foreigners that come in and live among the people, but they don't have anything because they don't have a land possession. So they're going to be poor in the land, you see. And God is very concerned about that. And he's concerned about these servants. They're limited under the book of the covenant. They could serve 6 years. Under this regulation, which defines it, they could go longer if the Jubilee is longer to there. But they would do that as hired individuals paying off a debt, you see. There'd be more like that. Is that you understanding what we're saying here? Okay. Any questions? Anything? Anyone want to say about some of this? No? You got it? All right. These are the capital crimes that are listed in here. These are not all of the capital crimes, as we'll see. But these are specifically noted early on in this book of the covenant. And what they say is not just law. I mean, they're based on God's view of his covenant agreement with the people. So you don't murder one another. If you do, life for life, you see. Premeditated murder called for execution. And how did they execute? Do you remember? Usually by stoning. That's correct. By stoning. And I'll not go into a lot of specifics right now about how that took place among these people, but it was pretty gross. You can imagine stoning someone to death and what that would look like. Yes? No, they didn't. Usually execution took place pretty quickly, sometimes within a day. It did. So, assault on one's parents was a capital crime. Cursing one's parents was a capital crime. Kidnapping. See, all of these have to do with the sanctity of life and the sanctity of the home where the life is preserved. And the home was considered to be the center piece of the social order in the land of Israel. They depended on the father in the home to take care of the activities of the people in the household. It was not just a free exercise of whatever you wanted to do. Teenagers weren't excused as much as they are in our society for getting out of bounds, if they did. And as a result, they didn't as much. But the sanctity of human life and the civil order in the land were the reasons for God's order on these matters, you see. And that comes through as you read it. If you look for that, it's in there as you go along. Sacredness of human life, and then order, civil order, societies being lawful, people being law-abiding citizens. That was essential. And where it got out of hand, that's where God stepped in. And if it was bad enough, God said, we'll have to eliminate those people for the sake of the society, you see. And Tim, I think you're right to point that out, that it didn't take 30 years to execute somebody. That would diminish from the purpose of it. The purpose of the execution was to maintain the civil order. And that had to happen quickly, get that person out so that society could adjust and do right, you see. So that's what that... yes, there were rules on execution and judgment and crimes and all of that that come out. Very good. Yes, you're right about that. Yeah. Did everybody hear what she's saying? That there were guidelines, witnesses, multiple witnesses. You had to have 2 or 3 witnesses in a capital crime judgment, and so on. Those rules were established as we go along. Okay? Well, let's move on down just a little bit, down to verse 18. I think those capital crimes are listed in the intervening verses, aren't they? 12 to 17 section. Yes. Okay, I didn't have that on the slide properly. All right, now then, people harming each other, verses 18 and 19 of chapter 21. And again, now you can see this concern for civil order and your neighbor, care for your neighbor, and so on. If men contend with each other and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die, but is confined to his bed, if he rises again and walks about outside with his staff, then he who struck him shall be acquitted. He shall only pay for the loss of his time and shall provide for him to be thoroughly healed. So that's an interesting thing now that is imposed on people that damage one another, you see. He's to be acquitted, that is, I think, in regard to those capital crimes that were in the verses just preceding this. In other words, you don't put him to death if this man recovers, you see. But you do pay for the loss of his time, and you provide for him to be thoroughly healed. So today, in a court case, what that would be, provide actual damages. I think they would probably be called something like actual damages, what costs are in a lawsuit. I don't know if Linda would like to instruct us. You used to work in a courtroom, didn't you? Did they talk about actual damages, like hospital costs and things like that? Didn't they get involved with civil suits in that way? What your action actually costs. Then you have punitive damages, don't you? And that would be punishment above the actual costs, if we're talking money, I guess. or whatever. Okay? I won't ask who's been involved in civil suits here. We have got into such a litigious society right now in so many cases that demand such high things beyond actual damages that sometimes it appears sort of ridiculous to us what's happening in our court system. But God did provide for actual damages under the law. Okay? Violence. In verses 18 to 27, you can read some of this. The general rule for lasting harm to a fellow was, if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. The point of this, I think, is, you see, the Israelites didn't exactly do this as time went on. I mean, I don't know in the Bible of cases of cutting somebody's hand off. Do you? Is there a case in the Bible like that? Anybody remember? I think they observed more the, what do I want to say, the justice involved, that there should be punishment that fit the crime, and that's the idea. And you will notice as you read through the observances of the law, through the books of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, you'll see that there was equal justice for everybody under the law of Moses. And the benefit to the offender and to the victim was a fair trial in all cases. So Western law is partly based on some of these kinds of sentiments today. You see? Okay? Yeah. Speak up so the ladies can hear back there. Yeah. Motives tend to get lost sometimes, and God's motives for his laws basically were established around the kind of people he wanted them to be, the kind of character he wanted the nation to exhibit, and so on. You see, that becomes important in the divine book, not so much in the human books of law, but God's law was based on God's character. Okay, good. Anybody else? No? All right. So we'll watch this. This seems to be observed as a general regulation rather than so specific. It could be administered, but yeah, there has to be justice. Mm-hmm. That's correct. That's correct. Okay? They could go to this and appeal to this, but there are consequences for the offender, too, that the people might want to show compassion or sympathy and handle it with payment, maybe, and so on. We'll have some rules like that a little later on. Okay? Animal control. Do you remember these? If an animal kills a person, if it's the first offense, the animal is killed. If it's known to gore or to be wild animal and has had a history of that, and the owner hasn't taken care of it, then the owner is to be responsible, you see. An animal could get loose and do something, but if the owner knows that and it has a history of that and doesn't take care of it, then he's responsible for it. So that's an interesting thing that we might think about under the law of Moses as we go. There are some challenges similar in our culture today with like guns. If a child gets a hold of a gun, a young person gets a hold of a gun and does something, the parents are sought out. Now, how fair you want that to be, I don't know, and how fair it should be applied in every individual case is an issue. But it kind of states the same principle, doesn't it? That someone responsible in a given situation becomes an offender themselves. So you can think about that one. Okay. Property reparations in chapter 22. The thief may be slain while doing the crime. So if somebody breaks into your house and he's stealing your stuff and you catch him, you can shoot him. I don't guess they had Winchesters or 45s, but they could take care of the situation on the spot under the law. A little later on, once they get into the land, there are going to be some provisions for thieves or for those accused of being thieves to go to cities of refuge where they can get a fair trial and where they can avoid being killed themselves for what they had done. If one lost possessions and the one causing the loss was found, that person must make restitution and restore double, or be sold as a slave, as a servant. So that was a law in terms of theft, primarily, in these cases. Okay? Do you have any comments on these, any of these? Okay. Then there is a series at the end of chapter 22, a series of moral laws and ceremonial laws that the Jews had to observe. In the case of fornication, unmarried people, they were to get married. That was going to be the rule. So if a man was to sleep with a virgin, he was to marry her. That gave a little more significance to that sin, didn't it? Yeah. I'm trying to think through the cases. I don't think she would, because he would be put to death. That gets us closer to what you... All right. I guess this is foreseeing agreement between the two to commit the sin together. So if they did, then they should marry. Yeah, consent involved. Good question, though. I guess that would be the way to avoid having to marry him. Get him stoned. All right. What? Seduction. Than in rape. Yeah, probably so. Okay. Well, the people were not to involve in sorcery. And the word sorcery used here probably is the more general term that would include all these different kinds of pagan appeals to the stars and appeal to the afterlife, involvement, seances, different kinds of things that the people might do. And why would sorcery be so important to these people from God's point of view? From God. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the sorcery has to do with their relationship with God. So if they're appealing to the stars for whatever, or they're appealing to animals, if they're appealing to the dead to return to them and give them information and all of that, that's not trusting in God. That's not appealing to God for your moral base and your information, spiritual information, and so on. So they were forbidden to do that from the beginning, actually. It was equal to idolatry in God's mind as you read those things. Okay? Different kinds of sexual sins are forbidden in this section. No sacrifice to other gods. No mistreatment of strangers. That's Gentiles, foreigners coming into the communities, widows and fatherless children. And there are probably more statements in the law on that one regulation, no mistreatment of other people, than any other single law that God gave. I think there are something like 23 or 4 times where that law, don't mistreat the poor, and other words associated with that, in the regulations of the books of Moses. Okay? If you borrow money from a brother, take no interest for the loan. So you could take interest if you loaned a Gentile money, but you were not to have interest on a fellow Israelite. That was a very strong law, rule. You return security items to the owner the same day. Things you borrow, you give him back. Like if you borrow his tools, you take them back. You don't do like Dagwood and Blondie, in the cartoons, and keep them. You get them back, and you give them back the same day. So I had to borrow one of those knives from Danny, my neighbor next door, the other day. One of those cutters for PVC, and I have a small one, but this was a bigger pipe, and I couldn't get it to work. So my neighbor had one. So I told him, I said, I'll be back with it in 5 minutes. I just need to make one cut. It did take me about 20 minutes because I'm not very good with that machine, but I did get it back to him within an hour. And so you return what you borrow. I would think in the case of, say, a garment that you borrowed when it was really cold, that the principle of this would be get it back to him as soon as the need is over. But the idea is don't borrow your neighbor's stuff and keep it. Get it back to him. Don't curse God or the ruler of your people. We ought to think about that occasionally, and maybe so more in the next year when we're looking at who should govern us in our country. The New Testament talks about this too, incidentally, about being careful what you say about your ruler in your land. And the firstborn would be dedicated to God. Can you give me an example of that? Who? Samuel. Samuel is a good example of that. Hannah dedicated him to the Lord. And the firstborn was to be done that way. And they take Jesus up to the temple, you remember? Partly in fulfillment of this guideline for the people. Okay? provide justice for all. In chapter 23, there is the Sabbath law for the land. The land was to lie without being tilled or sown on the seventh year. It's called the Sabbath year. And then they were to have 3 annual feasts, which we'll talk about in our class. The Feast of Passover, which was the unleavened bread, Feast of Unleavened Bread. Pentecost was the harvest, and Tabernacles. Those were the 3 required feasts where they had to go up to Jerusalem if they were well enough to go. They were obligated to go if they lived in the land. They were to go up to Jerusalem 3 times a year, living in the land. Okay? Well, that brings us up to getting this writing done. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 elders were to go up to the Lord from among the people and worship God close to the mountain. Moses alone would come near the Lord and go up on the mountain. And Moses then built an altar at the foot of the mountain that the people would worship at. And we'll get to that next time, I guess. Any comments anybody wants to make? How do you feel about the law of Moses after looking at it this way? Was it so terrible? There is a justice in it that we sometimes, in our human thinking, feel is not compassionate enough. But things had to be taken care of, and there are bad people. And the law provided to take care of that and to maintain social order in the land. And so God was going to do that.